going to talk about how Eleanor defined her leadership, with the caveat that I ask you all on bended knee to realize that every spouse who inherits the position defines it to their own expectations, because there is no job description for a first lady or a second gentleman. So, with that, what I would like to do is begin to bust some stereotypes about Eleanor Roosevelt, because more than anyone, with the possible exception of Hillary Clinton and Nancy Reagan, she is totally buried in stereotypes. Stereotypes that she helped promote in order to conceal her influence, and which she did because she did not want to make FDR look weak. And she was of the generation that if the public knew the influence that she had or did not have, it would weaken the public's affection and respect for her husband. So we begin to get this great image of Eleanor as a woman of sorrow, a child who had an undeniably horrific childhood. Her mother was so cruel to her that she thought she was so ugly that she called her granny, told her young child that her mother's greatest fear was that Eleanor would grow up to be an old maid and live her life locked in an attic. Her mother died when Eleanor was 6, and 4 years later, her beloved father, Elliot, dies of addiction to alcoholism and morphine. So Eleanor, at a very young age, had to figure out how to construct a new life for herself. This was not an easy process. By the time that she's 14 or 15, she is sent to Allenswood Academy in London, where she studies with the incomparable headmistress, Mademoiselle Marie Souvestre, who saw in a very young Eleanor a brain and a heart that could, in fact, lead in a way that would change the world. Eleanor so loved being at Allenswood that she wanted to stay there and become its civics teacher. She didn't want to go home. She wanted to spend the summers with Mademoiselle Souvestre. But Mademoiselle Souvestre told her 2 things. First, you can travel with me, but you must learn to be independent. You must learn to make your own budget, stick to it. You must learn to plan your own itineraries. And most importantly of all, when you visit a different country, you must realize that you are a guest in that country, which means that you must try to learn to speak the language, that you do not expect them all to speak English, that of course you visit their high spots of their culture, the museums, the operas, the fine restaurants, but you also contribute. So you volunteer in hospitals and in settlement houses and in what we today would call refugee enclaves. So Eleanor embraced this just as she embraced Mademoiselle. And when Eleanor is 18, she graduates. She's summoned to come back to New York to make her debut because her uncle Theodore Roosevelt is president. Eleanor doesn't want to go, but she realizes that she has a duty to go. And Mademoiselle Souvestre writes this young woman whose graduation picture stares you in the face the following letter. Of course you must go home. After all, you are a Roosevelt and you have your own responsibilities. But first and foremost, you are my Eleanor. and I expect great things from you in your own right in this world. Eleanor will carry that letter with her throughout the early days of her marriage, throughout her first struggle for independence as a young married political wife in New York, as First Lady of the United States, as a member of the first American delegation to the United Nations, as the architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and as the voice of the Democratic Party in the late 1950s. So this also is how we think of Eleanor. Sitting behind FDR, thoughtful, kind, but always her husband is the focus. She is there over his shoulder with a demure, wise smile, but you do not think of her as a policy operative. You either think of her as his eyes and ears, a phrase that makes my blood pressure go through the roof, but one that she embraced, that he created to give her the latitude that she needed to have to reconstruct her life once she moved into the White House. So before we talk about Eleanor's leadership, how she developed those skills, how the issues to which she devoted them, and the extent to which she was successful, I want to walk you through a little bit of the evidence that I will use for this talk. We're going to divide this conversation into three groups and really sort of focus on 5 different years, if you will. The first thing we're going to do is talk about how Eleanor became political in her own right on issues that FDR was unfamiliar with, and how she risked her own income, her own reputation, and her own physical safety to address them. And this is a constant trait throughout the 3 components of this talk: her activities before she moves into the White House, when she's in the White House, and what she does after the White House. And for those of you that are obsessed with dates, the White House years, I thought we could focus on 1933, when they first come into the White House, 1935, which is euphemistically called the Second New Deal. And then we can look at 1941 and the beginning of the war. Then after the war, we can talk about Eleanor's battle with Truman, her appointment to the United Nations, and the work that she did to combat what she called the politics of fear. So what's the documentation for this? I mentioned a little earlier that I founded the Eleanor Roosevelt Project at George Washington University. Eleanor wrote more than 8,000 columns. The importance of this cannot be understated. When she first starts to write them, oh my God, they're just boring as hell. They're just like, oh, at 9 o'clock I did this, 10 o'clock I did this, 2 o'clock I did this. But she did it in a way to bring Americans into the life of the White House and into the policies that the Roosevelt administration was promoting, and also to give Americans their own place to exchange ideas and to open a conversation with her. By the time that World War II starts, Eleanor is the 3rd most syndicated columnist in the United States, and was even more read and listened to than the extraordinary journalist Walter Lippmann. And before FDR used radio, before Jack Kennedy used television, Eleanor saw it as a crucial meeting to engage the American public. But most importantly of all, Eleanor corresponded with the American public. And I said that we were going to talk began in 1933 with the White House. So just hold this thought in your head about Eleanor as a master communicator by the time she moves into the White House. I just briefly told you about the trauma of her childhood, the courage and empowerment and encouragement that she got from her teacher. And when I read this quote the first time, I just thought, my God, Eleanor has opened up. She writes this in a question and answer column, if you ask me, the year after she leaves the White House, and as she takes on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At this point, there have been 15 assassination attempts on Eleanor Roosevelt's life. She refuses Secret Service protection. And so in that context, I ask you to think about this quote. My greatest fear has always been that I would be afraid physically or mentally or morally, and allow myself to be influenced by fear instead of by my honest convictions. I just want you all to think about that and think about what makes you cower, what makes you feel guilty that you don't speak out or act out, or when you think you have sold out, or when you have rationalized this behavior because you were afraid to say what you really felt. And if you incorporate this in your gut, then you'll have some understanding of what made Eleanor Roosevelt tick. So how can we begin to talk about Eleanor's execution of political coalition building, organizing, the influence she had on her party, her husband, major political institutions, and the American public itself? Eleanor's major concerns throughout her life, and which she will later say become the fundamental principles of human rights, as well as the fundamental principles of building democracies, are not civil liberties. They're not the right to go to church. They're not the right to pray. They're not the right to speak out. They're not the right to organize. It is meeting your basic needs for food and shelter. She says when people go to bed starving every night, with their stomachs growling, fearful of when their next meal will come, or worried about how they can care for the people they love, democracy fades. When people do not feel safe when they go to bed, when they feel physically vulnerable, when they fear death, torture, imprisonment, gunshots, death by pneumonia and other diseases that could infiltrate unsanitary places, dreams die and democracy fades, and people will not have the fortitude to really defend and execute democratic principles. So in 1933, when she's First Lady, she goes into the White House with her own political career under her belt. She has to resign positions on 17 boards, including some of the major labor unions in New York State. She helps found the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. She is incredibly involved in the living conditions that Russian, Polish, Jewish, German, Italian immigrants confront in New York City. She is traumatized by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. She follows Mademoiselle Chauvet's great guidance and volunteers in settlement communities when she's 18, 19, and 20. Unlike most debutantes who go to the balls to find a husband and to launch their careers in social society, Eleanor strives to balance working with the immigrant poor and her responsibilities to her family. Because of this, it is Eleanor who will introduce FDR to poverty.